In this video, I'm gonna show you why you should be using multiple versions of Blender on your machine, and I will show you not just how it will speed up and improve your workflow, but also how it will remove a lot of frustrations regarding Blender, especially when you're working with add-ons. Now, this video is not just for beginners, it's also for intermediate users. I didn't know this information when I started, and once I realized that I can use multiple versions of Blender at the same time, it changed completely the way I work with Blender. Speaking of beginners, if you're starting your journey in Blender and you're interested in mastering hard surface in Blender, then I would highly recommend our course, which is called the Hard Surface Accelerator. It's fantastic, it's a very tight curriculum, and it will teach you everything you need to know about the basics of Blender, the menus, the tools you need to use for hard surface, then the entire process of modeling, starting from the cube, the block out, the detailing, then obviously texturing, rendering, and finally editing your render. So this course shows you the entire workflow from A to Z. It's divided into very logical sections, so you can easily progress through the content. We have several thousand students who enrolled in the course and hundreds upon hundreds of testimonials, and people absolutely love the content. So click the link in the video description or in the pinned comment below the video and grab the course, and if you do, you're gonna get a nice discount for good luck. So I'll see you inside. So going back to the topic of our video, why do you need multiple versions of Blender? Well, there are multiple reasons for it. Reason number one, Blender is evolving quite quickly and sometimes introduces changes that are going to alter totally the way you model, or they're going to introduce a change which is going to mess with your add-ons, right? So, for example, Blender 4.0, when you want to auto-smooth your mesh, you simply add a mesh, you right-click, shade auto-smooth, and it's going to add this data here on the normals. Now, if you're gonna go to Blender 4.3, for example, or 4.2, you're gonna right-click on the mesh, right? Shade auto smooth, and then you will see that Blender is gonna add a modifier that's actually running on geonodes. So this section is completely gone. And by the way, if you're a beginner, you have no idea what auto smooth does. It's really important for hard surface modeling because auto smooth will tell Blender which edges should be shaded as sharp. So for example, if auto smooth here is at 30 degrees, which means every single edge above this angle is gonna be shaded as sharp, if I'm gonna add a loop here and start pulling this edge, eventually it's going to snap. See, at 30 degrees, Blender is going to recognize that this should be a sharp edge. And if it's lower than that, it will be simply smooth. Another example would be changes between Blender versions that impact changes to add-ons. So if you're working with add-ons, then it's also important. For example, Blender version 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3 all use different versions of Decal Machine because of changes to node system, which completely changed the way Decal Machine had to connect to nodes. And Decal Machine runs on nodes because that's how decals are being simply managed. So what you will need for each of these three Blender versions, you will need different decal libraries. Number three is going to be conflicts. So for example, let's say you got conflict errors and pythons in one of the versions of Blender. Let's say you're running add-ons and something got corrupted and you cannot progress with your work. Let's say you have even a bigger problem. You cannot save your file because your file that's been saved is corrupted. It happened to me before. What you can do, you can simply press A, Ctrl C, and copy objects. And if you do not see this window here, you can go and under extensions, you can enable copy attributes menu, add-on or extension. And it will allow you to copy stuff from one Blender to another. And you can close this, open Blender 3.6, for example, and you can just simply Ctrl V. Boom. And you're gonna copy paste your model to another Blender window, because it may happen that even if you open the same version of Blender, it's still gonna get corrupted. You see what I mean? So you want at least two versions. Another reason for running multiple versions of Blender is gonna be that simply maybe for one Blender version you would have a very specific add-on setup. So let's say in one Blender you have a very specific setup for modeling, and in other Blender you have a very specific setup for texturing, or let's say optimize your mesh, or let's say, UV unwrapping, right? So just to make your Blender lighter, you don't want to pack all the add-ons into one Blender, you want to split them into two Blender versions. Another thing I can tell you is that you can not only run multiple versions of Blender, You can open them at the same time, right? So I can open Blender 4.3 obviously, and I can also open, 3.6, etc., etc. I can open all these versions at the same time, no problem, as long as your computer can handle it. But in addition, you can open multiple windows of the same version of Blender. So watch, if I'm going to drag and drop this blend file into 4.4, it's going to open one blend file, right, with one cube. But if I'm going to drag and drop this one, I'm going to open another blend file with the same version, right? Now you can see I got two 4.4 alpha versions running on my machine, and they both have different files open. So you can do this as well. So there are many reasons of running multiple versions of Blender. And if you're going to, install at least 2 or 3, you're going to be fine. And another thing that I want to talk about is this folder. This is kind of like a bonus for this video. This took me actually quite a long time to figure out, and I didn't think about it before, but now I actually do it religiously. Because, like I told you, Blender versions can vary between one another, and the changes can be so dramatic that you're going to be needing different versions of add-ons for each of these versions of Blender. It's really important to create some sort of a folder system in which you're going to be storing specific versions of add-ons for that specific version of Blender. So for example, in this folder, I have very specific versions of add-ons that I know they work not just with this Blender, but they work with one another. So I have no conflicts, no errors, no pythons, no issues, no crashes, right? It's a tested sort of an add-on setup. And this is a crucial thing to understand. If you try to run these add-ons, right, on Blender version 3.6, it will not work. It will probably not even open or it crash immediately, or you will not be able to do anything, because simply they're not designed, they're not coded for this version of Blender. So if you do not store your add-ons in a specific folder and you do not save them, and you want to use this version of Blender for a longer time after it actually is removed from the main page on blender.org and it goes to previous versions of Blender, add-on developers might remove the old versions of their add-ons from the store, like Blender Market. For example, if you try to download older versions of Hardops, you can't do it. If you want to download older versions of Decal Machine, you can't do it. So if you do not store it on your PC, you're buggered, right? So what I suggest you do, once you install one version of Blender and you test all the add-ons that work with that version of Blender, you store all the add-ons in one folder, including assets as well, because like I told you, for example, a Blender version 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3, all of these versions have different versions of decals for decal machines. So decal maps from or decal libraries from this version will not work in this version. You will have to upgrade them. But if you try to use these decals in this version, it will not even open. Decal machine won't even start, right? You'll see blank slate. So this is really essential. And especially when you're a beginner, you're going to be very confused when you start working with add-ons. Because, for example, you're going to open an older version of Blender, let's say 4.0, and now we're on a version 4.4 or 4.3. And Blender will tell you, when you open Hardops, let's say, it will tell you, you should update this add-on, right? And you do that, and your Blender starts crashing, and you don't know why. The reason for it is very simple. You update it to a version of add-on that it's not going to work with this version of Blender, all right? So this is really essential to understand, and it's going to save you a ton of headache and frustration. And let me tell you, since I started doing this, I have zero issues with add-ons, right? None. And in addition to this, I can go back to any of my Blender versions that I know are stable, and I can just simply work in them. And lastly, speaking of stable versions of Blender, when you're going to be working in this fashion, it will allow you to keep the most stable versions that that are 100% bulletproof. There were no issues, no crashing, no pythons, because sometimes they release a version of Blender which is pretty messed up, and they need to fix it, and they release multiple versions of it and keep updating stuff, and it's difficult to keep up. So when you find a version that it's really stable and it's working really well, like for example 3.6 or 4.0, this was one of the best versions of Blender. I got all the add-ons needed for this version, and I have them forever. So I can always go back to the previous version of how it used to work. In this case, it's going to be, the old auto smooth behavior, and I can simply model in this version if I want to, right? In any case, this would be everything you need to know about why you should be working with multiple versions of Blender and how to do it. And again, if you're new to Blender, or even if you're intermediate, check out our accelerator course. The link is in the video description. And like I said in the beginning, if you click on the link, you're gonna get a nice discount for good luck. So click the link in the video description and I'll see you inside of the course. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.